Carney's carbon tax will push businesses to leave Canada, to cut production in Canada, and to increase production in the United States. So essentially, Carney's carbon tax is the worst of all worlds, higher prices and fewer jobs here in Canada.
Many Canadians may attribute the consumer carbon tax to Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, or Stephen Guilbeault. But in reality, the history of the carbon tax goes back even further. In fact, there's so much history to the carbon tax that Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation decided to write a book on it, which launches this week.
Let's take a look. And here he is, Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Franco, it is always a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I love coming on the show, love talking to you guys, and just really appreciative to talk to your audience again.
All right, let's get into it. Tell us about this book and what prompted you to write a book.
Yeah, well, I got the book right here, right? The
Awesome.
physical copy in my hands, so it means it's real now. Axing the Tax, the Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax, available on Amazon. It'll be in bookstores as well. Amazon, the best way to get it. I wrote this book for two reasons, right? The first reason is because I think ordinary Canadians deserve it. Like, I think the fight against the carbon tax is really the David versus Goliath story, where for, at least a handful of years, going back a decade plus, you had a lot of the political elites, whether it was politicians, government bureaucrats, environmental activists, the taxpayer-funded academics, many pundits in the media class, essentially forcing the carbon tax on Canadians, saying, sit down, be quiet, pay your carbon tax bills. And it would have been easier for so many Canadians who are just busy with their lives of raising kids, grandkids, going to work, paying the bills, to have just taken it, to have sit down and not push back. But, so many Canadians for so many years worked very hard to defeat the carbon tax, whether that was going to rallies, organizing rallies, getting bumper stickers, posting on social media, talking to their friends, family, and neighbors, or, contacting politicians. So we now see that the support for the carbon tax has completely collapsed. I think it's fair to say that the carbon tax fight is not over yet, but it's on death's doorstep. And I think Canadians just have to, appreciate how much work they did to fight the elites in the political circles on their carbon tax. But, the second reason I decided to write this book is because you can already see a lot of the activist class, whether that's bureaucrats, politicians, environmentalists, already trying to frame the debate, trying to say, well, the carbon tax is a good idea. It was just Trudeau who bungled the policy or didn't communicate it well enough. But I think this book shows two things. Number one, the carbon tax always was and always will be a bad deal for Canadians. But number two, the fight is not over yet, folks. And this book has a lot of details on what to be prepared for as politicians try to relabel, repackage, and hide carbon taxes.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is that, this didn't start with Justin Trudeau. It actually started much, much earlier. And, it went through some conservative iterations and some liberal iterations, and here we are. And you just touched on the fact that the fight isn't over, and Mark Carney has indicated as such in his platform. And I think his approach to this is going to be one of, well, I'm just going to put the carbon tax where you don't see it. So if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and that's all there is to it. So, what is your take on the way he is now looking to implement the carbon tax?
Well, what's that old phrase? The king is dead, long live the king, right?
Yeah.
Like, folks, the fight against the carbon tax absolutely is not over. And Carney has been very clear. He's not scrapping carbon taxes. He wants to change the carbon tax. Those are his own words, right? Change the carbon tax. So look, you heard this from Carney. You also heard this from Chrystia Freeland when she was running to be the Liberal Party leader. Their problem isn't the carbon tax. Their problem is the consumer-facing carbon tax, right? They still want to hit you with carbon taxes. They just hope you won't notice. So what Carney has done, folks, like he has set the consumer carbon tax rate to 0, right? Okay, but here's the thing. Number one, the carbon tax law is still on the books. So technically, after this election, when those politicians are done singing for their supper, knocking on the doors, they can come back to the House of Commons and crank that carbon tax all the way back up and even higher. So we have to make sure the next government repeals the carbon tax legislation. But number two, Carney wants to essentially hit Canadian businesses with these big hidden carbon taxes, and then he hopes you won't notice when they pass some of those costs on to you through higher prices, right? It's this industrial carbon tax. But look, a carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax. When you carbon tax a refinery, that makes gas and diesel more expensive. When you carbon tax utilities, that increases the cost of home heating. And when you carbon tax fertilizer plants, for example, drives up costs for farmers and it makes food more expensive. But, you know, Carney's hidden carbon tax on business also has another element to it, because you have to think of the global context, right? The United States doesn't impose like a national carbon tax or a carbon tax on business. So Carney's carbon tax will push businesses to leave Canada, to cut production in Canada, and to increase production in the United States. So essentially, Carney's carbon tax is the worst of all worlds, higher prices and fewer jobs here in Canada.
And that's one of the things I learned about in your book was carbon leakage. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Okay, so I fundamentally believe that the reason that Canadians don't support the carbon tax is because it makes life more expensive and it doesn't work. And when I say it doesn't work, I mean it's not an environmental solution, right? So number one, Canada makes up 1.4% of global emissions. Very minuscule. Number two, the vast majority of countries do not have national carbon taxes, including some of the largest emitting countries in the world. So carbon leakage essentially explains why a carbon tax doesn't work, okay? It's a very wonky term, but essentially what it means is that when a jurisdiction like a country like Canada imposes high energy taxes or high environmental regulations, that doesn't necessarily reduce emissions. It just pushes businesses, investments, and industries to leave that high tax jurisdiction and set up shop in other countries. That's the theory. Now let me just boil it down so it's easy to understand. The Lower Mainland, right? Vancouver, Coquitlam, Langley, for years had some of the most insane gas prices. Well, what do a lot of motorists do? They just go south of the border and they fuel up. That's an example of carbon leakage, right? Or how about this? Christy Clark, all the way back when she was the BC premier, BC had the highest carbon tax for a long time. Well, Christy Clark even made the example saying, well, why would I keep increasing carbon taxes in BC? That's not going to reduce emissions. It's just going to push businesses to go to other provinces. And, you know, carbon leakage, the environmental activists understand what carbon leakage is. They understand this fact of reality. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they push for a national carbon tax in Canada, because they knew if there was only one province that had a carbon tax, it wouldn't reduce emissions. It would just increase emissions in other countries. Likewise, you have these international organizations, these international media elites, and even some of these international high-flying politicians and bureaucrats who are pushing for global carbon taxes because they understand carbon leakage, right? If it's only Canada and a minority of other countries that have carbon taxes, you're not going to reduce emissions. You're just going to push businesses' investment to other countries. So emissions could actually go up as businesses leave high tax jurisdictions and go to lower tax, lower regulation jurisdictions.
Well, and this is the irony. They could quote unquote claim that, look, we're reducing emissions, when in reality, it's just these companies that are producing these emissions. They're saying, see you later, and then leaving the country. And you've not only reduced emissions, you've reduced jobs, you've reduced GDP, and you've reduced everything else that actually makes our economy hum.
Oh, 100%. You know, like, how much are we reducing emissions if businesses just leave Canada and go to the United States?
Right.
The answer is we're not, right? We're just hurting Canadians, fewer jobs, less growth, less tax revenue to pay for more hospitals and more education, like schools and stuff like that, right? But like, so this is at the end of the day, is that everyone knows that the carbon tax makes life more expensive, right? The Trudeau government, his ministers, Guilbeault, they all tried to spin Canadians that somehow the government could take $20 from you and give you $50 back. Nobody believed it. But on top of the obvious fact that a carbon tax makes the necessity of life more expensive, which is a feature of a carbon tax, not a bug, was this fact that it doesn't work, right? Canada, very minuscule amount of emissions on the world stage. But like even in Canada too, right? So British Columbia, the first place to bring in a North American economy-wide carbon tax, they legislated in law that the carbon tax would reduce emissions by a third by 2020. Yet you use the BC government's own data and it shows that emissions have gone up. Why is that? Well, it's a simple fact that you can't tax away the necessities of life, right? Just because you put a tax on gasoline, diesel, propane, natural gas, it doesn't mean that people now don't drive to work. It doesn't mean now that people don't heat their homes. It doesn't mean that people now don't buy food. Of course they do, because these are necessities of life. All that happens is that those Canadians, like many others, just have less money in their budgets for all the other priorities of life.
Well, it just proves that if you're dealing with a government and they're trying to solve a problem either with taxes or spending, you can virtually guarantee that the problem is not going to be solved. The only way to actually solve problems is to implement policy that is actually going to affect real change. So, and I think your book kind of lays that out, very, very well and builds that case. One question I had for you, so there's a lot of angles that you attack this in the book. Did you already have all that research done, or did you really go down the rabbit hole when you decided to actually write the book?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, you remember the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we've been fighting carbon taxes for about 2 decades now, right? Like we've been fighting this all the way back when it was first introduced in British Columbia, or even when Stéphane Dion ran in 2008 under the Green Shift and his federal carbon tax. So, we've been fighting this for about 2 decades. So a lot of the information we already had. But there was one thing that actually stuck out to me, right? Because we had all the data. So then when you're writing a book, you're trying to fit it all together and kind of see what the key themes are. Like, we knew the carbon tax makes life more expensive. We knew the carbon tax doesn't work. We had that data. But one of the interesting themes from all of the research that we've done over the years is that, all these smart people in the media, all these talking heads, they were always telling you, politicians had to impose a carbon tax to win an election. Remember the 2021 election, right? All the big smart talking heads in the media saying that. But then when you actually look back, politicians were never even running on carbon taxes, right? So that was one of the themes that was clear in my book, is that, politicians were never honest with people about their intentions on carbon taxes or the costs. And because they were never honest with the people, they were never honest with themselves about the lack of support for higher taxes. So let me just lay this out. So BC, the first province that brought in an economy-wide carbon tax. The election prior to the carbon tax imposition, not a single mention of the carbon tax. The word carbon wasn't even in the platform, and the only mention of an environmental tax was to cut taxes. Okay, then you have the Alberta NDP that brought in a sneaky carbon tax in 2017. They didn't run on it in the election before. The same story happens in Ontario. And of course, a similar story also happened federally when Trudeau came to power in 2015, right? If you think about the 2015 election, you probably remember legalize weed, expand immigration, but on taxes, you probably only remember the tax cut for middle-class workers and those working hard to join the middle class, right? You had to squint very hard to see any mention of a carbon tax in Trudeau's platform, right? And look, Trudeau and his prime minister's office and the team around him, they saw that Canadians had widespread support for improving the environment, that they convinced themselves that Canadians could afford a massive tax that increases the necessities of life, even when the polling was showing them otherwise.
Well, and it all comes back to this whole flawed premise that has been tried in multiple scenarios of, well, it's going to be a revenue neutral carbon tax. And in all scenarios, it was proven to not be revenue neutral, or they said, you know what, that revenue looks pretty nice. We're going to use it for something else. And you talk about that in the book as well. But we don't want to give too much of the book away. So it's a great read for anyone that has watched Franco speak on the CTF channel or on any of our interviews with Northern Perspective. What I said to Franco is, as I was reading the book, I was literally hearing him speak to me, which was great, because it means that the book is as engaging as it is actually watching you speak. So on behalf of all of your readers that are going to read this, thank you for writing it in such an accessible way.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. It was really a ton of fun to read. And you know what, folks? It's not just like wonky economics. I think it actually does a good job poking holes in the economics of carbon taxes, like fundamentally at its core. But it's also like a history of politics, right? There's a ton of history, a ton of political nuggets in there. And also, I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but there's some political spice, right, behind the scenes that was never reported on before. There's some dirty laundry that's going to be aired in this book that I really think just everyone's going to like. And hey, let me just end with the final pitch. Mark Carney, the current prime minister, he wrote a book that was hundreds of pages long, praising the carbon tax. This book, it's the exact opposite. It hammers the carbon tax. It's the book the carbon taxers don't want you to read. Again, folks, Axing the Tax: The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. If you're like me and you like to get your books right away, you can order it already on Amazon.
All right. And we'll be ordering a copy for our library here at Northern Perspective. And the official launch date is tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yep. Thursday, April 10. Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for writing this book and bringing more sunlight to disinfect this dirty, dirty carbon tax. And hopefully we can continue the fight and prevent it from ever coming back and eradicating the remnants that exist in our federal system at this point. So, Franco, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, guys, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. I really appreciate this conversation.